Hi, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some basics of genetics for 7th grade life science. The person's name that generally comes up in life science is that of Gregor Mendel, and that's this guy right here. Gregor Mendel lived from 1822 to 1884, and he was an Augustinian abbot, and that's why he has that outfit on. And what he's famous for is for his experiments with pea plants. And during the years of 1856 to 1863, about 8 years, he did experiments breeding over 29,000 pea plants, quite a bit. And when you talk about his experiments, generally we use this type of thing, this Punnett square, to explain how they were working. But at the time, Mendel wanted to he was trying to figure out how traits got passed on, and his work was extremely important. In 1866, he presented a paper on all of his experiments, and it wasn't very well received at the time. But later on, it was well received, and he found some important ratios in his experiments that since then have gotten him labeled as the father of genetics. So let's go backwards a little bit, and there's some vocabulary you should know. This thing here is a chromosome, and humans have 46 or 23 pairs of these. And if you remember back to our cell unit, chromosomes are only visible during mitosis. They're always there, but they're made of wound up DNA. And it's a way of packaging the DNA so that when your cells divide, you get a full set of chromosomes in each new daughter cell. Now, a gene, this term is thrown out quite a bit, and a gene is really referring to a section of that chromosome, or a specific section of the DNA. And that section has the instructions for a protein. So that bit of DNA controls some trait. So a gene, the simplest way to think of it is instructions for a trait. And that could be a simple trait. In Mendel's experiments, he did stuff with traits with pea plants. Now, where this gets confusing is the word allele. And if a gene is the instructions for the trait, the allele is which version of the instructions. And sometimes these words get used as synonyms, but they're really not. And there's a time to use one versus the other. Gene, we're generally talking about this section and overall what it controls. When you're talking about an allele, you're talking about, okay, which version is here and which version is there. So there's usually on each side on the chromosome pair there's a gene that might control a trait, and when we use the word allele, we're talking about which version is here, which version is there. For humans, a really simple Mendelian trait is on our head. Here's a weird little person, and there's an ear. And this one you can see there's an earlobe. Remember in class we talked about this. So we might be talking about do they have the allele for attached earlobes or unattached? And that's always referring to the version. And then there's a Punnett square. So when we're talking about Punnett squares, this kind of fills you in. The way you use a Punnett square is you write the alleles that a parent has for a trait. This is a simple Punnett square. We're just doing one trait. And you remember on the previous slide, you have this chromosome, and you have an allele here and an allele here. Well, one allele goes to this side, and one allele goes over here. That's for one parent. And then the other parent would have two alleles here. And then the way you fill out a Punnett square is you draw that allele here and that allele here, and then this one gets copied over and that one gets copied over. And what this does is it shows you the probability for the possibilities on that one trait for the offspring. So if you were to breed these two pea plants for pod color, there's a 50% chance that the offspring would have a yellow pod because there's 2 out of 4 squares, and there's a 50% chance of green color. And that brings up the next two things, dominant allele and recessive allele. Now this is something Mendel noticed in his experiments. He didn't use the term allele, we found that out later, but he talked to dominant and recessiveness. He discovered this idea. So the dominant allele is this one here. And the reason it's dominant is because if we take a look at this individual, this offspring, this parent has a yellow color. This parent has a green color pod. And this offspring would have a yellow. Even though it has the green allele and the yellow allele, what happens is the yellow allele overshadows it or hides it, and that's why it's called dominant. The recessive allele is down here. And to show the recessive allele, there can't be a dominant version. So to have a green pod color, you have to have 2 recessive alleles. That brings up 2 other pieces of vocabulary to talk about this, heterozygous and homozygous. And if you think back to English class, this is made of 3 Greek and Latin roots that we studied. Us, which is pertaining to, zygo, which is a pair, and heter, which is different. So this is referring to a pair of alleles that's different. And when you have a dominant and a recessive pair, that's called heterozygous. Homozygous is when you have a pair of alleles that are the same, and that's right over here. Now this would be called homozygous recessive because those are 2 recessives. You could have, so homozygous recessive looks like this, and homozygous dominant would look like this. Either way, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, they're both homozygous because you have the same 2. Heterozygous, they're different. All right, now let's take a look at how this relates to some of Mendel's experiments. Let's, for instance, talk about his pea plants. So remember, he did this with 29,000 pea plants. So whenever you see diagrams, they always talk about which generation he had, and this is usually called the pea generation. It doesn't stand for pea. It goes back to Greek and Latin roots, which I'm not going to bore you with right now. But what you do need to know is in this generation, they were always purebred or bred true. So he had this group of pea plants that would always be tall. And he had another group that would always be short. And he took pollen from one group and mixed it with the other, let the seeds grow, and then planted them. And what happened is all the offspring ended up being tall. Now we can go backwards and apply this to a Punnett square. And we know since this group was always tall, there were 2 dominant alleles for height, and since this one was always short, there were 2 recessive alleles. Now if we fill out the Punnett square, it looks like this. And what we have there is we have a homozygous dominant parent, a homozygous recessive parent, 100% of the offspring, 100% would be heterozygous. And because there's a dominant allele here, all of these would be tall pea plants. So they all look tall, even though they didn't have the same alleles as this one, they looked the same. So then what he did is he took peas from these and brought them over here. So this one became a parent here, and let's say this one became a parent over here. And those were tall pea plants, they looked the same. And then he crossed those, and this is where he found a ratio that consistently sprung up for certain traits. And what happens is if you fill this out, you end up with 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous. The thing is, these are all tall. All 3 of these look tall. And then you had this 1 homozygous recessive, 1 short. So you have 75% tall and 25% short, or a 3-to-1 ratio. So you have the 1 short and 3 tall. And he found this ratio to be fairly common throughout a bunch of traits, and traits that follow this dominant and recessive pattern are labeled Mendelian traits. The one last thing I want to throw in there is when we're talking about the alleles that an organism has, that is referred to as its genotype. So when you hear the word genotype, you're talking about the alleles, and we could say that genotype is heterozygous. If we're talking about the phenotype, phenotype refers to what those alleles actually make it look like, or the physical traits, if there is a physical trait. And the phenotype for this would be tall. So hope that helped you out, and good luck.